Thank you, Sheila, for those warm words. Pleasure to be here again, and welcome everybody. Nice to see some traditional faces and some new ones, and so many people sporting my eyewear. Very good. Okay, a new revolution. I think most of us are rather tired of revolutions at the moment, because before the May election in this year, we had a Farage revolution, a Russell Brand revolution. And I think we're all rather tired of such an approach. However, I think all of us are aware that we have a problem. In fact, we have a big problem. We have domestic problems and we have international problems. And it would be nice to try and restore some of the equilibrium and balance and a bit of common sense as to what is going on. Those of you who might remember, in the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama published a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And this is actually, in my opinion, quite an important philosophical work at the time, because he essentially was saying the Soviet Union was dead, Homo Sovieticus was no more, and that democracy had won and we were all going to be okay. Now, as we know, that proposition was rather wide of the mark. And about 5 years ago, a book was written by a guy called Robert Kagan called The Return of History and the End of Dreams, which essentially acknowledged that that lovely idea that when the Soviet Union ended, everything would be okay, was not a worthwhile proposition. You may have noticed some of the disturbing trends in retailing recently, where you walk into a store, for example, I think it was TK Maxx, and I saw this wonderful sign saying, "Grab it before someone else does." So we're sort of in a big grab it retail mentality, and my suggestion really is that the lifestyle that we are actually seeking is out of stock. So what to do? We're gifted complainants, but I don't hear very many propositions as to what we can do to fix this. So, essentially, those of you, I think, will know that I've spent quite a lot of time in the optical industry. I've spent a lot of time in aeroplanes, a lot of time in airports, and that gives you a lot of time for thinking and reading. Now, where have we come from? What are the big changes so far in society? Well, we've essentially gone through, if you want to call these revolutions, 4 revolutions. The first one, Leviathan, was a proposition by Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher. We'll look into this a little bit later, but he wrote this book called Leviathan, which essentially was the first recognition, in my opinion, of what we now come to understand as the state. So that was a big revolution in thinking. Secondly, the industrial revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. We established a lot of our social situation and a lot of our education systems based upon our requirement to supply the needs of an industrial revolution. People came in from the fields, started to work in factories, we started to live in conurbations, and an awful lot of where we are today stems from that particular viewpoint. The Germans in the 1870s decided that manufacturing things was a better idea. We thought empire was terrific, and that's where the split happened. And of course, as a result of the wars that we have fought in the 20th century, the welfare state essentially was begun by Lloyd George in 1911 with the introduction of pensions, and an awful lot of the 20th century has been dominated by social awareness, if you like, and the welfare state. I think we're all aware that the welfare state now is a little bit of a problem because we really can't afford it. So what I'm going to describe today is one way that I think we can afford it, because money is not a problem. I think all of us realize there's quite enough money about, it's simply in too few hands. And this is a major problem, and we'll talk about why. And the fourth big change, of course, is technology, which, as we all know, is proceeding at a huge, huge pace. Now, I gave up the corporate world over 20 years ago. My last business card didn't have an email address on it, and I did not carry a mobile phone. Thank God. Because I feel very sorry for corporate executives today. There is no escape at all. And this is a major problem. Technology actually is a two-edged sword, and in my book I describe is there good technology and there's bad technology. So this is essentially, we are in an amazing speed pace of change, and of course the wisdom quotient is not keeping pace. We're very gifted inventors, but we don't think about the consequences of what we do so often. Okay, Thomas Hobbes, I talked about Leviathan. He published this book in 1651 and essentially identified three types of common wealth. One was the monarchy, aristocracy, and of course the other very important one was democracy. I talk here of Oliver Cromwell's miss. This is not his mistress, this is not his daughter, this is essentially... Oliver Cromwell declined the throne in 1655, and in the Restoration essentially gave... feudal tenure was abolished and power was given back to the House of Lords. And in so doing, Cromwell's great miss was not to establish common ownership of land in a much wider way. So the House of Lords and the government, the governing classes, were given control of the land, and we are living with those consequences to this day. And that is massively, massively serious. Because all the money, the ill distribution of the money, as we shall see, comes from this particular point. So, the land held by the Crown was sold in 1660, and there that's where we are today, essentially. Now, those of you who know that I've been in the optical business for about 40 years, and I've actually dealt with seconds of arc, minutes of axis, very, very fine degrees in everything. It's a very, very focused thing. Any opticians in the audience here? Any lens manufacturers? Okay. Essentially, we all of us talk about, for example, light. Light illumination is a metaphor for truth. We talk about this quite a lot. So if we want to become aware of something or more informed about something, we talk about light. We talk about clear vision. Clear vision, clear visual perception is something to do with knowledge. This is something that we actually all seem to get in bed with. And really, so much of what we see today is actually focused on vision. We talk about focus. We talk about hitting targets. We talk about seeing things clearly. But one of the things I thought about, I spent so much time dealing with very, very small calculations on prism and such things like this. There's a great danger of becoming very over-focused. We're now becoming, because of the technology speed development system, we're becoming so specialized and so over-focused as individuals. I wonder if we're not overdoing this slightly, because the ability to see the big picture seems to be reducing. And I think there's a reason for this, because as the population expands and we do become more technical and more scientifically specialized, it's very, very tempting to actually retreat in time inside your own speciality box and become so specialized in point of fact that you're not open to criticism anymore because no one knows what you're talking about. And this is a big problem. So I think that there seems to be a trend for the academic class, if you like, or the academic institutions they don't seem to be prepared to move outside their conventional wisdom paradigm, if you like. So therefore, I think an excessive amount of reductionism, I put here the reductive is destructive, because I think that as you reduce things to definition, that ultimately destroys what you're trying to do. Those of you who don't have a ticket to see Ian McGilchrist talk tonight, consider yourself deeply unprivileged. I suggest you dip into your wallet and buy a ticket, because this will be a very special occasion. This book, in my opinion, is the most significant thing to be published in the last 15 years, because what Ian's done here, he's discussed very clearly and it's very easy to read and understand. He's discussed the linear left brain and the holistic right brain, but for me the most important thing was the philosophical drive here, because I won't say too much about this because he's talking later tonight and I'm sure he will. But it's an extremely important book for where we are headed as society today. And there is an interesting tale to this, actually, because about a year ago, my partner Annie and I, we sort of got together and I was on a trip around the UK in my camper van and we were exchanging a few messages. And I happened to say I was reading this wonderful book, The Master and His Emissary, by Ian McGilchrist, and she emailed me back saying, I'm doing the same thing. So I owe Ian actually a degree of, how can I put it? I think he gave me a subconscious reference here, which did my prospects no damage whatsoever. So I'm very grateful to Ian for that. But it is a wonderful book, and I can't recommend it too highly. So I'm going to talk about 3 books today. That's one of them. Right, I think we all agree at the moment we live in a disunited kingdom and a disunited world. Now take the UK first. Essentially, I think we need to redefine what the word politics means, because we're all getting a little bit excited about this. And I think it's important to understand what that word means. And there are many different interpretations. I was in India for a few weeks over the winter, and I asked a German political student, he was studying politics at university, and I said, what does the word mean? I got a 5-minute long-winded answer, not answering my question at all. It was a classic indication of misunderstanding, in my opinion. And politics, to me, is the art of social organisation. Now, we haven't seemed to have decided whether our members of parliament are legislators or social workers. It's an interesting thing. Where's the job description? What are they supposed to be doing? So we do understand that they are corrupt, essentially. They understand it doesn't work. I have said that if they gave me 30 minutes to devise an expense system that they couldn't cheat, I can do that. I ran a sales force, and believe me, sales guys on the road can cheat you unless you have a PhD in doing it properly. And if anyone ever accused me of cheating my expenses, I would say, it's in there, boss, find it. And if he could fire it, if he could find anything, then I deserve to be fired. These guys are running circles around themselves because no one seems to have run a business and no one seems to understand how to design an expense claim form. It's not hard. Give me 30 minutes and I can have that locked up. So is politics the art of the possible? Is it the getting and keeping of power? Is it a continuation of the vested interest? And I think the answer is all three. So the application of the politics is one of the 5 philosophical disciplines, but its application should be scientific. This is fine. Why do we need reform? And more particularly, we understand we need reform, but how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for real reform? Those of you who have done any sort of economic studies might be familiar with David Ricardo. Now, interestingly, this guy had more of a take on how to administer taxes than anybody who's ever lived. And yet, his laws of economic rent, for example, which we discuss a little bit later, is significantly important because we're not short of money. We can afford a health system. We can afford property. We can afford what we want without national debt and without income tax. Income tax we can abolish. So I'll talk about in detail his law of economic rent, but essentially how the great tax scam works is quite important because we have a group of people who are lucky enough to own their homes, and we have another group of people who have to rent. How many people in here own their home? How many rent? Okay, we have a high proportion of home ownership here, but how this works. In, for example, central London, the Crossrail project, lots of construction going on, and who actually benefits? Who pays and who benefits? So we have a massive transportation system going, and they will say, well, the City of London needs this, etc. But what is happening is the people who own the buildings, the Canary Wharves and things like this, these are the people actually who are getting the return on all that infrastructure investment. So fundamentally, the business, take for example somewhere like Canary Wharf, which obviously generates trillions of pounds, and how much does it actually pay for being there? Ricardo's law of economic rent essentially works like this. It taxes the value of the output of land. And the great value here is that you can't put an acre of land in your pocket and take it to Liechtenstein, Switzerland, or Moscow. So you can abolish income tax, we have all the money in, as long as we actually tax the value of where the land is and what it does. We'll come on to that later on. So we are in a situation where we are being taxed unfairly, we don't trust the taxation system, and a lot of people do everything they can to avoid paying taxes, which we all hear. Corporations avoid paying taxes, and if we can avoid paying taxes, we will. I've said here we would keep bad taxes on consumption. I think taxes on things like sugar, cigarettes, alcohol, and so on and so forth to discourage excessive consumption is a good thing. To explain this in detail, economic rent is not a property lease. You come to, when you come to rent a flat from a landlord, it's not the same thing. So we have a situation where we have people who own and people who rent. Now, if a landlord owns a block of flats and he is getting an enormous amount of rent out of that, that is a huge amount of income, and he's not doing anything for that. He simply owns that space. So we have a situation where if you were able to have a set figure, for example, the government can tell you how much pensioners can live on, it can actually come up with a subsistence figure for everybody. And we have a lot of regional equality. For example, in central London, find there's a lot of money generated, but you start going out to the margins, for example, like Cornwall or the northeast of England, and things get very much more difficult because poverty very much is regional. So life at the margin is tough. So essentially we have the state is perpetuating a huge degree of unfairness here by the way it taxes people. I strongly suggest a look at this book by Fred Harrison called House Prices and the Great Tax Clawback. This explains, and it says why Tony Blair's project failed. This is really why New Labour has been a bit of a fake. Fred Harrison in this book explains Ricardo's law extremely clearly, and it's quite a tough subject, and it's not socialism. It truly is not socialist at all. So a lot of people say, oh, well, if you own your house and you're paying tax on that land, surely this is socialism. No, it's not. It's actually taxing the use of the land. Again, I highly recommend this. I found this in the course of my researches, and it's a brilliant expose on government fiscal failure. So let's see how that works. Okay, we have this triangle here, ABC. Now, the vertical axis, A to C, is essentially your land use. All along the bottom we have A to B, and that adds up. When you add up the interior of this, you actually have, this is the value, this is the total income of the economy. So as you see, if you take London at point A, that's where the money's being earned. So you've measured the output in the economy by that vertical axis. Now, if you reduce the A to B line, you cut that down. Now, that makes a bit of a mess of the whole project. And here's how we destroy national income. Now, if we were able to say, right, everybody in the country is entitled to £300 a week to begin with, it's a subsistence figure, everything north of that number is actually, that's what is produced, that is the value of the land. So you can see on the Z-axis, at point Z there, we have, this is right out on the margin here. Now, if you were to raise taxes to here, that means Y to Z becomes part of the welfare state. It becomes cost. So in other words, the amount of income generatable is reduced. So raising taxes is actually counterproductive. It doesn't work. So if it was your personal deal to have a £300, no taxation, no nothing, we're all allowed that. That's the agreed subsistence level, and everything north of this then goes into the output value of the land occupied. So it's actually a much, much fairer system, and the amount of money involved there would enable us to abolish income tax. Income tax was introduced in Napoleonic times, and the last time it was actually seriously discussed to be discontinued was 1873. And I think William Gladstone might have been being a little bit mischievous here in suggesting that, but then we got involved in the 1874-1880 period in Afghan wars and things like that, and we lost the opportunity then to actually change the thing. Now, why didn't the Victorians adopt Ricardo's economic land taxation system? Because the landowners who had been given the deal by Oliver Cromwell, when turkeys don't vote for Christmas. But it is a much, much fairer way of funding the economy, and the money will go around. What happens when you have a situation of one lot of people have got it this and one lot of people don't, in the end, there will be a fight. And I think all of us know the statistic that 85 people in the world seem to own more than the bottom 3.5 billion. Well, whichever way you look at that, that can't be right. However, to actually look at this subject in detail, because it's not quite like watching paint dry, but it can get a bit like that, have a look at Fred Harrison's book. I really recommend you can do that. It's well worth it. Well, what can I say? Poverty of domestic politics. We have a system in here in the UK, I'll talk about the UK first, whereby we have something in the order of 656 MPs. So we have one MP per 90,000 people. This is an absurd degree of over-representation. It really is. It's crazy. The situation with the expenses and the cash for influence business goes on, and nobody seems to be able to fix it. We don't trust it. We know it doesn't function. Even the MPs admit it's not functioning. They just say it's not fit for purpose, to use the current expression. It's designed, the system is inherently designed to protect vested interest, and it does that very well. However, no point in just screaming and shouting about it, in my opinion, because nothing ever seems to change. We can rant and rave, we can complain, we can do all we like, but nothing ever changes. The reason is it's really completely out of touch as far as local people are concerned. We don't trust local government. We see it as a huge source of waste. Now, when you pay council taxes, this goes to Westminster, and 75% of it would be rebated from there. So when you pay local council tax, don't think you're paying it to them and they're using it. It's not that simple. So I would say that our institutions actually are completely out of date. And sadly, because I adore the subject of Victorian politics, it's something I'm very interested in, and my next book will be on a Victorian politician who has not been written about. So it's sad that the system essentially is crumbling. Is there anybody here that particularly trusts the Westminster Village? Not a great show of hands there. Now, here's the crucial bit. What to do to change it? Well, we actually have the entire infrastructure under our feet right now. If we were to appoint 250 district assemblies of 250,000 people, for parish council, read district assembly. And I'm getting rid of the name council because it's discredited. So you could have 250 district assemblies of looking after 250,000 people, largely elected the way they are now, but very accountable to local people, responsible for education, responsible for the police, responsible for the roads. In other words, very accountable. I would then propose 125 regional assemblies. Now, we have huge numbers of council buildings in all parts of the country. We could quite successfully have 125 regional assemblies that look after 500,000 people. And if we have one from each district, that will give us 250 members, one from each district. Perfect. So then what we then do is we have a regional assembly. At the moment, we have all this talk about, we have the whole thing in Scotland, we have devolution in Wales, we have devolution in Northern Ireland, we have people now talking about devolution for England. This would satisfy that particular requirement, because for certain areas of the country have very well represented local government, others, regional government, others don't. So this would completely satisfy that regional opinion. And I think the devolved government, which seems to me to be adding a layer after layer of unnecessary expense to the system, can be done away with, unless the people vote for it. And if they understand they're paying taxes for it, then that's fine. Now we come to the interesting part, National Assembly. I think we need about 125 members, and that's one from each region. That means each region actually would have equal say in representation, and that assembly would take care of only 3 issues, because after all, let's go back to the description of what is the job description. Are they legislators or social workers? Well, I think there are 3 what I call supranational issues that they could take care of. Number 1 is issuance of the currency and control of the banks. I think we can all agree that this has just got out of control. This isn't even funny anymore. Secondly, we need to take care of border security and security generally. That should be a supranational issue. And thirdly, and most importantly, in my opinion, we need a thing called a skills forecasting unit. And this means someone has to decide how many people are going to live in this country at a certain date. If we want 90 million by 2050, this tells me we need X number of doctors, we need X number of opticians, we need X number of hospitals. There is, in other words, a long-term plan that says, if this is what we're going to have, we need to set our stall out to prepare for this, to have the professional services there. Because at the moment it seems to be, come all ye, the tail wags and the dog barks. Because we don't seem to have any kind of coherent structure going on. Our hospitals are under perpetual strain. Why? It's lack of planning. It's not money. There's money everywhere. We know this. It's lack of planning. So what power should reside where? Now, the district assemblies, going back to the Ricardo's economic law of rent, the district assemblies would administer that land tax, and they would be responsible for all non-supranational issues. Now, if you don't like something, or you want to have Mickey Mouse president of your local council, then call a referendum. Get 25,000 people to sign a piece of paper that said they want a call on this. I know we have some friends here from Switzerland. Switzerland actually, this idea is modeled around the Swiss system. Now, I understand that calling a referendum on a serious issue, it does require a number of people to stop flippant propositions. But I think at least it gives you the opportunity to say no, but it also gives you the opportunity to say yes. The important thing here with district assemblies, it gives local power back to locality. In other words, if it materially affects everything you do, you're going to take that rather more seriously than you do now. The turnout at local elections is, frankly, pathetic. So the real power for locality should reside in the people who live there because they know what's best for the area. Okay, the regional assemblies, that would set regional land taxes, responsible for the regional development, and an agreement on National Assembly funding. In other words, that supranational function at national level would be, what it costs to run that would be agreed by the regions. In other words, there's none of this elite saying, right, well, we need half the nation's income to run it. You don't. So, again, a referendum call of 10% of the franchise people. If you have an idea and you want something debated and passed into law, that's what happens. So this is all designed to pass power back. Now, at the national level, as I've said, these three things are quite important, an important thing. The whole referendum process can actually go exactly down the same route. 10% of the franchise, actually, that's important. So again, issuance of the currency and bank control, control of borders and national security, and skills requirement and population forecasts. It would seem that we're in a situation now where people are coming into the country, they desperately want to come into the country. Why are they doing it? That's entirely, I think, a question of debate, but obviously something's not right here. Okay. Moving on to the international stage, we have an enormous problem internationally. I think we all recognize that I think essentially there is a mismanagement of empire out there right now. The Americans actually run the last empire, I think it would be fair to say, and they're having a bit of a struggle. So, like it or not, that's where the Americans sit. There are a huge number of foreign policy problems we have. Go back to the Iraq situation. The Americans actually cleaned up in Iraq quite quickly against the Taliban, but they lost interest and moved on to Afghanistan, and this left an enormous void in Afghanistan, and the Americans chose to fund the Pakistan military to go and look for Al-Qaeda rather than their nominated government, and this is a problem. So many short-termist things are going on in foreign policy. It's not right. We have a situation where Pakistan was actually funded to chase Al-Qaeda warlords, but at the same time they were sympathetic to the Taliban, so you wind up actually funding the very people trying to kill your service personnel, which is somewhat strange. And we have this absurdity, as I call it, of war on terror. You can't have a war on terror because terror is not a party to the conflict. This is poor use of language. It's absolutely ridiculous. A lot of the American people seem to have a poor knowledge of the maps. I spent a lot of time in the northern countries, and I asked somebody in Oklahoma where Finland was, and it was very difficult to get within about a foot on the globe of where it was. So it gives you an indication of the inability to actually think on a wide, broad basis. But we have a massive problem of inadequacy as to where the assets go, and I think a lot of the problems we're facing now with a lot of these terror groups is that there is no real hope now in many parts of the world. And the amount of largesse financially that's handed out doesn't seem to be very equally distributed. So I think there needs to be a re-examination of the entire subject of funding international effort. And I have here, look at the maps. It's quite interesting. In 1878, when Disraeli and Salisbury came back from the Congress of Berlin, and someone said to Salisbury, oh, you know, Disraeli's done a wonderful job in the Balkans, and that was the source of the First War, incidentally. They just drew straight lines everywhere and said to Serbians, you're now Croatians, vice versa. The whole thing was a massive mess and really did lead to 1914. And Salisbury just turned around and said he had nothing to do with it. He didn't look at the map. And this is a major problem. If you look at the map of colonial Africa, this proves the point. You see straight lines everywhere. Well, if you've got goats, when it's hot, you go down, when it's hot, you go upstairs, and when it's cold, you go downstairs. So, getting back to the foreign policy situations recently, when you destroy a country or you go in and you invade it, the Rand Corporation of America actually worked out that it costs per capita of population $100 to rebuild a country. So in Bosnia, $679 a head got spent. Kosovo, $526 got spent. East Timor, which isn't probably that high on most people's geographical map, 233. Afghanistan, 57. What's going on? This is extremely strange. You go in and you fight a war that the Russians tell you you're going to lose. We've been in there 3 times and lost every time. And the country's invaded, the Taliban get a good kicking, and then the Americans leave and give the Afghan government $57 per head to fix it. Well, it's not working. This is absolutely absurd. So there seems to be a bit of a mismatch here. They invade Afghanistan, get bored, go on and invade Iraq, and the mess involved in Iraq is stratospheric. This is unbelievable. My young grandson said, why did they do that without fixing something to follow it? Well, if he could figure that out, why couldn't they? So it's a big problem. Saddam Hussein, as we all know, was a Sunni. 70% of the population was Shia. Who is next door in Iran? Shia. If you take Saddam Hussein out, he wasn't a nice man, obviously, but take him out, and who's going to exploit the vacuum? There we go. So we have a major problem. Very difficult. Post-conflict nation rebuilding is something that needs to be taken far, far more seriously if we're not just going to leave a trail of destruction behind everywhere. It's going to be just a huge, huge mess. And it's getting worse. How do we stop people like ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, etc., etc.? Where there is no hope, what is there to stop the youngsters picking up guns and doing something? Because if they have no job and no prospects of a job, life's tough. If your grandfather was born in the same refugee camp that you were, you're entitled to ask a few questions. What's going on? Not right. So how do we stop this? It's all very fine. I think we all know it's a mess, and that it is a mess, but how do we deal with it? If we were to give each nation, there is something in the order, I think, of 196 United Nations recognized nations, where if we gave each nation a seat at the table, at least a genuine seat at the table, this would be a real start. We need to actually establish real and genuine free trade. And this free trade and education, in my opinion, are 2 of the most important things we can do for A, the world economy, and B, world peace. Because if you make something and you can send it somewhere to someone who wants to buy it without corruption, fake tariffs, and all these other things, the world economy actually gets moving. And guess who came up with the whole theory of free trade in the first place? You guessed it, David Ricardo. This was one very, very bright guy. So free trade is absolutely essential. If a country is good at it, Greece actually was pretty good at tourism. How do we get to interfere with all that? Greece was great at tourism. Leave them to it. What's the problem? So people who are good at things, let them do it, let them export it, let other people buy it, and don't put protectionist barriers up everywhere. Protectionism was a huge problem in this country. Robert Peel repealed the Corn Laws in 1846 against massive opposition because the landowners, who coincidentally happened to sit in Parliament, thought their entire economic structure was going to be completely wrecked. Didn't happen. Just didn't happen. So we became a free trade nation, and in fairness, we do talk about free trade in quite a big way. The Americans talk about free trade, but they are probably the most protectionist of all. So that's a really, really crucial thing. And there are ways we can actually have that done. I would also try and make war an expensive and illegal process. I was talking to someone about this yesterday and said, come on, this is utopia, you can't do this. Well, actually, I think there is a way of doing it, because what is war? It's largely conducted by men dressing up in coloured clothing, waving sort of machines around and killing each other. There should be a testosterone warning, actually, because it's dangerous at birth and then it's dangerous on the battlefield. So essentially, there are ways to do this. Again, I go to a lot of detail in my book about this. It's you meet a lot of people on peace studies and things like this, and they say, well, yeah, mate, shouldn't do war and so on and so forth. It is the breakdown of the diplomatic process. However, it's very expensive, very silly, and look what it does. It's crazy. So I think we can actually, as long as we link that to free trade, we're on a winner there, I think. And you can link free trade to democracy. We'll see how. So if you have a democratic mandate and you get a free trade license, then the goods can flow and the whole thing stays pretty reasonably peaceful. And again, we need to have proper post-conflict national reconstruction, because if you leave a pile of rubbish in your wake and you don't clear up after yourself in invading countries, you just have a mess. People will exploit the vacuum. And we're not doing it. It's not on an organized basis. Why are we so surprised that there's such a mess in Afghanistan, Iraq, and everywhere else? Why? It's nuts. There hasn't been proper attention to this. It's a real problem. Now, we have United Nations at the moment, which I think most people would agree is actually pretty toothless. It's a terrific idea, but it's not enforced. It doesn't seem to be a useful organization. I would actually have a United Free World Trade Association, and the wording is very, very specific. There are 196 recognized nations at the moment, and it varies. Sometimes it's up and down. I would give each of those nations a seat at a World Trade Association, and I would impose a 10-year democratic or non-military qualification. For example, if we've obviously had a democratic process for many years, we would get a seat. Lots of countries would. The reason for 10 years is because someone who pops up tomorrow and says, I'm a democracy, and then changes his mind a week later, we've got a problem. So, or I've got here a non-military qualification. That allows China, deliberately allows China to actually, it's impossible to ignore China, because China and India together have something in the order of 43–45% of the world's population. So to leave them out of the equation is just foolish. So China, of course, has adopted a capitalist system financially, so they would be entitled by that. So membership of that organization would entitle you to an export license. These are just ideas to get the whole thing running, essentially, on a more equitable basis. So you could export as long as you're a member of that particular association. And I've got here, you must subscribe to an anti-war mechanism. Again, in my book, I describe how that would work. And it's a long proposition to explain it here, but it is possible, actually, to legislate against war generally. So I've listed how that could be done. Again, these are ideas, but it does stop just crazy behavior, I think. I would also give a 5-year probationary period for new democracies. So we have a situation where, for example, as has happened in Spain, Greece, Portugal, where you've had military government and it's been changed, the democracy has actually become part of the system. Then after a 5-year period, that we can probably say, well, that's going to be pretty much entrenched. So we'd have a probationary period of 5 years for new democracies to give them a license to actually join the commercial club, if you like. And most importantly, I would eliminate all subsidies and all forms of protectionism. Protectionism we discussed, but subsidies, again, are a terrible distortion of the world economy. I mean, you look at situations in America where they're producing crops for ethanol and things like this. It's nuts. So all forms of subsidy I would simply dispose of, because everything will find its level. You don't need to subsidize things. It just distorts the situation. The French particularly are pretty good at subsidies, as we know. And this really does distort the whole thing. Because where you get what I call fake assemblies, for example, the European Union essentially is a fake assembly. And that has all sorts of weird and crazy laws and subsidies going on. Laws against subsidy, laws about how to apply subsidy, the whole thing, absolutely ridiculous. So we have a situation that is so distorting that it's very difficult to find out where the whole thing lies. We are in a situation, I think, pretty much globally now, where we really don't know where the economy is. In this country, it's so distorted with credit and debt that you're exhorted to sit on a new sofa, God knows how many times, buy a new car, do this, do that, borrow the money, keep you in the system. That's a real problem, because if we were actually to stop all that, and I make the proposition, I would actually abolish credit cards and give everyone 10 years to pay it off, we would actually find out where the economy was, because we don't know. It's a myth. You hear a number, and isn't it interesting how those numbers keep getting massaged and changed? I quote numbers in my book at about 2008, because I reckon by now I might be able to rely on those, because the numbers keep being massaged. I'd love to know where the economy actually is. How much money is there? So if we actually had the revolutionary idea that if you want to buy something, you've got to have the money, this is going back to probably the 1950s, that's quite a revolutionary idea, but that would slow the whole thing down, and then we'd find out who actually could do what, because we just don't know. They talk about constant growth. There's got to be growth in the economy. Where's it coming from? Where is that growth coming from? You can't predicate an economy on endless growth. Steady state economics is possible, but we have to rethink so much of what we do. So that's so important. If we have a situation where we have an international free trade situation, and somebody steps out of line, goes to war, does something like this, take the license away, impose what we understand today as sanction-type penalties, and we're going to be in very interesting territory, because it will dissuade people from taking unilateral action. The world economy is, in my view, essentially a blown-up fake right now. We just don't know where we are. Very, very difficult. Now, there really is such a beast. Those of you, as you know, I'm in the lens business, or was in the lens business, and I still do some spectacle dispensing, but when I was making lenses, I used to actually make things like this, a quadrifocal lens. This means you can actually have 4 focal lengths in one lens product, which is actually quite interesting. That means you can cover pretty much any eventuality. If you're an electrician, a plumber, fixing dials in the roof of aeroplanes and all sorts of things. Why do I mention that? Well, because this 4, I think, I call them the quadrifocal menace, because we have a major problem with these 4 industries and what to do. The food industry, for example, we're now in a situation where we have 1 billion people on the planet don't have enough to eat. We have another 1 billion so obese they can hardly move, or overweight. We're in a really crazy situation. This is a management problem. We have so many fat people. Let's tell it how it is. There's too many very fat people because they eat too much, and we got another lot of people who don't get enough to eat, that they're starving. This cannot be right. And the food industry shoveling processed sugar down everybody. Apparently the average gentleman or person in America drinks 800 cans of fizzy pop a year. That's a lot of sugar. How can you stay thin on sugar like that? And it's not doing much for you. So the food industry actually is so busy pumping out inexpensive, not very nice food because it's cheap. And that's a major problem. So we have a taxation issue on food here. I would actually tax fizzy drinks and packets of crisps to hell. I would raise the amount of money on a can. I would have a can of Coke costing about £3. Why not? Because it's an absolute disaster. If you've been in a supermarket and there's someone behind you in a trolley and there's packets and packets of 2-litre bottles of, I'm ranting here, 2-litre bottles of Coke, and packets of crisps the size of a compost bag that you would buy in a garden centre, something's going on. And it's no coincidence they're not particularly slim people. Right? So I think that and the only way to solve this, well, there are two ways really, is education, that's for sure, but secondly, it's got to be hit in the wallet. It's got to become expensive. And then the politicians leap up and down and say, well, it's only the poor people who are going to pay. Well, sorry, change your habits. This is not good. And the food industry, essentially, very well established, very well connected. The food lobby is very, very, very clever. But we need to tackle this. And my proposition about reforming the whole government structure and bringing this right back to local level actually would help a lot. So you want to run a food factory in my territory, you pay. So that's quite interesting. The pharmaceutical industry is, I spent 2 or 3 years in this before I got into optics 40 years ago. It's quite an interesting business because what you have is you have the food industry piling you up with all sorts of garbage. You get out of the supermarket and there's a salesman from the pharmaceutical business saying, no worries, here's some pills. We can sort that out. So the food industry is the sort of feed you up business. The pharmaceutical industry is going to fix it, so they get tons of money for actually fixing the problem that the food industry sorted. And then, of course, the bankers will take care of all the results. That's fine. So the big pharma is another big problem because no one's addressing the cause. They'll take the symptoms and they'll deal with that, but no one's looking at the cause. And I put it to you that a lot of the problems that we have actually is with food because we're not eating stuff that actually is any bloody good. So I know that maybe fruit and veg isn't everyone's perfect idea. They might prefer donuts and cream and so on, but there has to be an education program with the kids, and there is evidence this is beginning to start. So this essentially educating people into doing some of the right things. And I don't think this is big brotherdom, it's common sense. You just feel better. You've got to feel better, you know, having a BMI of 25 rather than being 45 stone and you can't get out of bed. Don't convince me that's a life choice. That's nuts. That's slow suicide. Crazy. When you step out of the 5th floor of a building, you don't defy the law of gravity, you confirm it. You stuff yourself with 24 donuts a day, you don't defy the law of common sense. It's crazy. So we have the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry. I think that the whole government structure is actually keeping this in tandem. Their lobbying power is so huge that they actually essentially become protected species. They do pretty much what they like. And the NHS, the way we fund the NHS is so bizarre, and the pharmaceutical industry are now in a permanent fight getting massive sums for their drugs. And in the West, what we essentially have, I think, by and large, is that we have a lot of self-inflicted disease problems that the pharmaceutical industry responds to. So this leaves out the developed world a lot. Although we've recently seen some development on malaria and things like that for Africa, which is terrific, a lot of the pharmaceutical effort goes into dealing with self-inflicted Western lifestyle type diseases. And I'm talking about things like type 2 diabetes and all this kind of thing. So there is a huge amount of money just simply propping up the Western lifestyle, which could do with a bit of change. Okay, the banking industry. Oh boy. Okay. Right. Well, this is extraordinary. How the banking industry has been allowed to get away with what they've got away with, and they have got away with it, no question about it, is absolutely extraordinary. On the one hand, we have a situation where in 2008, the whole lot went to hell in a handbag, apparently. Banks going bust, we bail everybody out. Nobody's been to jail. Nobody's been to jail. It's quite extraordinary. And yet we paid the bill, which is extraordinary. It's amazing. So they still persist in conning us because you're familiar with the wonderful lavatorial phrase, quantitative easing. It sounds like gently lowering yourself onto the lavatory and having a bit of a contemplate, but that's not what it is. We were told this was issuing money into the economy. Not one single pound coin has been issued into the economy as a result of quantitative easing, yet there's 375 billion of something out there which was designed to support the whole deal. In actual fact, that was the issuance of government securities which stopped the whole thing collapsing. So what happens is all that money has gone into shore up the balance sheets. It's harder to get credit today than it was in 2008. If you're a member of the Federation of Small Businesses, you know that trying to get an appointment with someone with any authority is practically impossible, and getting the money is next to impossible. Interest rates have remained at 0.5% now for 6 years, hasn't happened since 1688, and it's fake. Now there's a lot of people got used to these low rates, and now Carney's talking about raising rates. Historically, they're natural interest rates between 4 and 5%. If mortgage rates go back to 4 or 5%, what will they charge people for a mortgage? Much more than that. So a lot of people are in for a nasty shock. That will depress the housing market, so round we go again. It's just endless. But the banking industry essentially is one of the 3 supranational issues that I would actually have under national supervision, because they patently can't run their own playground. If you go into a bank now and you want to borrow, say, £250,000, you ring a thing called customer services, they say, oh, where's your nearest branch? You tell them, you go and talk to a minion who has no authority, who then says, oh, well, I'll contact so-and-so, you will hear from them, you don't. This is a very common experience. So the whole thing is actually structured now to not do a damn thing meaningfully. They'll process your checks if you still do that. They're taking all the glass down in the banks. It's all very friendly, very nice. Have a nice day. Fine, but there we are. We come on to the armaments industry. Well, that's when capitalism gets into trouble, it goes 2 ways. It either goes protectionist, or fascist rather, or it goes socialist. It can only go in 2 directions when capitalism starts to crumble. Socialist, because the tax take declines, and the only way you can actually get more money into the tax coffers to support the welfare state is to raise taxes. So you depress economic activity. That's called socialism. As far as the fascist side is concerned, when things get really dire and the currency goes to hell and we all get a bit nervous, a strong guy stands up and says, I got the answers. And he surely has. He actually puts the nation back to work, typically in the armaments industry. So he solves the unemployment thing at a stroke. Everyone's working, everyone feels good. So you are now talking about people like Adolf Hitler, Stalin. There are plenty of them. This is how fascism works, Mussolini and so on. It's not a national proclivity. It's actually, it can happen anywhere. So that's what happens when industry, or rather when the economy actually seriously crumbles. And that's the big risk if we actually try and find out where the economy really is, because once again, we really don't know. The armaments industry, of course, is flourishing because there's always a fight going on. Only beware who you sell to, because he might be using them on you next year. So it's actually quite an interesting proposition, the armaments industry. So these 4, I call them the quadrifocal menace, because there's a bit of league going on here. There's a lot of cooperation going on here. Huge amounts of money being maintained and generated. So, not happy about that. So, okay. It won't surprise you to know that I have a book actually available outside, and this is the 3rd book I was going to mention. I actually was quite interested in calling this originally Leviathan Revisited, because I wanted to go back and look at what Thomas Hobbes had actually suggested we had created and re-examine it. So I called it the reform of common sense in the 21st century, because I think what's actually going on today is so bizarre and so against what I would call and understand as being common sense. It's truly insane, some of the things that are happening today, and we seem to be beginning to accept it. And I'm not sure this is a good idea. So we are gifted complainants, we will have a go, we'll have a moan, but what are we going to put in its place? So this is really a serious discussion document that says, well, here's some ideas. If you don't like it or you can do better, I'd love to hear, because I think we really do need to seriously begin to change what's going on, because it isn't working. And I don't think it's actually particularly helpful just to rant about it and say, you bastards, you look at you wrecking everything. Well, we know they're wrecking everything, but actually it's our votes they need. Now, the history of freedom, 1832 Reform Act until 1928, 96 years to actually, for all of us over the age of 21 to get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to actually get the vote. Don't squander that. 20 years to It's very interesting how this recent election, I think the low point was reached in 2010. We seem to be back on the way up now, because I think people finally realize if they don't exercise that vote, they're going to be in big, big trouble. Because someone is going to stand up, the strong guy is going to come along and say, I can fix this. Because it can be fixed, but it just won't be fixed the way that we like it. I think return power to locality, establish meaningful regional government, and let the top element of those three supranational issues be handled by fewer people, fewer expenses, higher quality people. I met a parliamentary lobbyist in India over the winter, and I said, you spend your time in Westminster? He said, yep, there's 656 of them, and I reckon there are about 25 that are any good. Now, that's serious. If you think about the real conviction politicians that there are and there have been, they're very few. And we need to sort that out. And I think if power was actually devolved down to locality, the way that everyone's talking about doing it now, we would get some quality people who are responsible and know they're accountable to their locality. Because they're going to be spending the taxes. It's their power, your community, your taxes, and you need to actually have a handle on how that's spent. The regional thing is important too, because we obviously seem to want to have devolved government in various parts of the country. Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall. I lived in Cornwall for years. There was even an independence for Cornwall party. So if those areas want that, that's fine, but they have to be prepared to pay the taxes to support it. Because this proposition actually makes it a much, much cheaper deal, because we don't have the money to squander on those projects. So I think the whole thing really does need to be absolutely overhauled and reorganized, and I rather hope that I hope I've given some kind of introduction. The book will explain this in a lot more detail as to how the anti-war mechanism might work, how the reorganized local government will work. But I think for me it's a start. It's something I had to get down, and I had to share, if you like, because I felt it to be quite important. Because as a student of history, looking at how things were and how things were progressing, it wasn't going very well. You could argue to turn the House of Westminster into a travel lodge. Only they wouldn't have it. It ain't good enough. It's falling to pieces. So to maintain our institutions with any kind of credibility, I think we have to stop following slavishly the American line and re-establish our democracy on a much sounder level, because I think that's what we all want. The polls seem to be saying that. The question is how to pay for it, and I think taxing the economic value of land is actually a way to go, because then we can abolish income taxes, we can have a health service, we can have all the social services. There is no shortage of money. If you tax something you can't put in your pocket and take away and smuggle and cheat and put through the banking system, we have a chance of retaining our share, because it's our heritage too. Okay. Thank you very much for listening, and just never forget, love is the engine of survival. Thank you.
Richard Smith.